In 1962, the executives of General Dynamics, an absolute titan of American industry, stood before a balance sheet that defied belief. The company had just recorded a net loss of $425 million, the equivalent of over $4 billion today. At the time, it was the single largest corporate loss ever suffered by an American enterprise. The culprit wasn't a catastrophic war, a government default, or a global recession. The financial black hole was entirely self-inflicted, born in their Convair division from the pursuit of absolute aerodynamic perfection. A few years earlier, Convair set out to conquer the commercial sky by building the fastest, most luxurious jetliners the world had ever seen, the Convair 880 and 990. They succeeded. They created breathtaking machines that flew at near supersonic speeds, beloved by the pilots who commanded them and the passengers lucky enough to fly in them. Yet within a heartbeat of aviation history, these magnificent aircraft were abandoned by the very airlines they were designed to serve, banished to desert boneyards while Boeing and Douglas inherited the world. How does a company build an undeniable engineering masterpiece, only to have it nearly destroy their entire empire? How does the fastest passenger jet of its era become a cautionary tale of corporate hubris? This is the story of the Convair 880 and 990. It is a story of eccentric billionaires, absolute aerodynamic obsession, and the brutal collision between the romance of flight and the unforgiving reality of the airline balance sheet. In the middle of the 1950s, the American aviation market stood on the precipice of a revolution that would compress global geography and redefine the business of human transport. For a decade following the Second World War, the sky had been ruled by the thunderous roar of massive radial piston engines. The Lockheed Constellation and the Douglas DC-7 represented the absolute physical pinnacle of propeller-driven flight. But those magnificent machines had hit an aerodynamic and mechanical ceiling. They were as fast and as large as piston technology would ever allow them to be. The major airlines, Pan Am, TWA, American, and United, were hungering for the next leap. That leap was jet propulsion. The jet age did not arrive quietly. It arrived as an industrial arms race. Up in Seattle, the Boeing Airplane Company had taken a massive, company-threatening gamble. They had poured their resources into a swept-wing prototype known as the Dash 80, a sleek, four-engine jetliner that would soon evolve into the iconic Boeing 707. When Pan American World Airways placed a massive order for the 707 in 1955, the tectonic plates of the aviation industry shifted overnight. Down in Long Beach, California, the Douglas Aircraft Company, the undisputed king of commercial aviation at the time, scrambled to defend its throne, answering the challenge with the formidable DC-8. Within a matter of months, the future of the long-haul, high-capacity airline market was locked in a brutal duopoly. Boeing and Douglas were offering airlines massive airframes capable of carrying up to 150 passengers across the Atlantic Ocean or straight across the continental United States. For any other manufacturer, this sudden dominance by two established giants would have been a clear signal to stay away. But General Dynamics was not just any manufacturer. Headquartered in the corridors of American industrial power, General Dynamics was a Cold War leviathan. It built nuclear submarines. It built intercontinental ballistic missiles. And through its Convair division, based in San Diego, California, it built some of the most fearsome and advanced military aircraft on the face of the earth. Convair was an engineering powerhouse, a company whose DNA was forged in the extreme demands of the United States Air Force. They had built the gargantuan B-36 Peacemaker, the bomber that carried the early American nuclear deterrent. They were developing the B-58 Hustler, a delta-wing bomber designed to fly at twice the speed of sound. They understood high-altitude performance, they understood advanced aerodynamics, and more than anything else, they understood absolute unadulterated speed. However, in the commercial airline market, Convair was dangerously late to the party. Throughout the early 1950s, they had enjoyed modest success building twin-engine piston airliners like the Convair 240 and 340, which reliably served regional and short-haul routes. But as the major carriers began writing checks for hundreds of millions of dollars to acquire four-engine purejets, the executives in San Diego realized they were entirely missing out on the most lucrative technological shift in the history of commercial flight. If Convair wanted to remain a relevant player in the civilian market, they had to build a jet. The tension in the boardroom was palpable. The brutal reality of airline economics dictated that latecomers rarely survived. Boeing and Douglas had already saturated the market for large, long-haul jets. If Convair built a 150-seat aircraft to compete directly with the 707 and the DC-8, they would be fighting an uphill battle against established production lines and entrenched airline loyalties. They needed a different strategy. They needed a niche that Boeing and Douglas had left undefended. The Convair engineers, looking at the route maps of American domestic carriers, found their opening. While the 707 and DC-8 were perfect for routes like New York to London or Los Angeles to Tokyo, they were arguably too large and heavy for medium-haul domestic routes, flights connecting Chicago to Dallas or Atlanta to New York. The airlines needed a smaller, specialized jet for these highly profitable city pairs. But Convair decided they would not just build a smaller jet, they would build a superior one. Drawing deeply on their military interceptor pedigree, the Convair design team proposed a machine that would rely on a completely different value proposition: speed as the ultimate luxury. Their new aircraft would not carry as many passengers as a Boeing 707, but it would fly higher and it would fly significantly faster. It would be a sports car in a market filled with buses. This was a seductive, intoxicating vision. The engineers envisioned a sleek, narrow fuselage paired with a highly swept wing, powered by commercial derivatives of the mighty General Electric J79 turbojet, the exact same engine that powered the supersonic F-104 Starfighter and the B-58 bomber. The pitch to the airlines was simple and powerful. Your premium passengers will pay more to fly on the fastest commercial jet on the planet, arriving at their destination ahead of everyone else. It was a brilliantly ambitious concept. It was also the first fatal miscalculation in a chain of decisions that would eventually bring the company to its knees. Convair was about to learn a harsh lesson about the American aviation market. In the military, speed is survival. In the commercial airline business, speed is an expense. But in the late 1950s, fueled by the limitless optimism of the jet age, that reality had not yet set in. The engineers in San Diego retreated to their drafting tables, ready to build the ultimate flying machine. They just needed a customer bold enough and perhaps crazy enough to buy it. If Convair was going to build the fastest commercial jetliner on Earth, they needed a launch customer with deep enough pockets to fund the development and a bold enough vision to understand the appeal. They found exactly that in one of the most enigmatic, brilliant, and ultimately destructive figures in American aviation history, Howard Hughes. In the mid-1950s, Hughes was not just a billionaire industrialist. He was a record-setting aviator who held absolute dictatorial control over Transworld Airlines. TWA was one of America's premier legacy carriers, locked in a bitter, high-stakes rivalry with Pan American World Airways and American Airlines. While Pan Am's Juan Trippi was buying the Boeing 707, and American C.R. Smith was leaning heavily toward the Douglas DC-8, Hughes wanted something else entirely. Hughes detested doing what his rivals did. He viewed the massive 150-seat offerings from Boeing and Douglas as flying buses, lumbering utilitarian machines built for volume rather than grace. Hughes wanted an aerodynamic thoroughbred. He envisioned an exclusive, ultra-fast jetliner that would cater to the business elite and Hollywood royalty. TWA's wealthiest passengers, he argued, would not want to sit 6 abreast in a crowded cabin. They would demand a premium, intimate flying experience, and they would pay a premium price to arrive at their destinations faster than anyone else in the sky. When the executives from Convair arrived to pitch their high-speed, medium-haul concept, Hughes was instantly mesmerized. Here was a company with military DNA, offering a machine that promised to outrun everything else in the commercial sector. In 1956, Hughes signed on the dotted line, ordering 30 aircraft for TWA. Delta Airlines, recognizing the potential of a fast, medium-range jet for their domestic routes, quickly followed suit with an order for 10. The project was officially a go, and the aviation world braced for the arrival of Convair's masterpiece. The aircraft that began to take shape on the drafting tables in San Diego was a marvel of mid-century engineering. It was deliberately designed to be smaller and lighter than the 707. Instead of the standard 6 seats across the cabin, Convair designed a narrow, streamlined fuselage that only accommodated 5 seats across. This reduced the aircraft's frontal area, drastically cutting aerodynamic drag. To power this sleek airframe, Convair turned to the General Electric CJ805 turbojet. This was not a standard commercial engine. It was a civilian derivative of the legendary military J-79 engine, the exact same power plant that pushed the Air Force's supersonic fighters through the sound barrier. The J-79 was a mechanical beast, utilizing a highly advanced variable stator design that allowed it to swallow massive amounts of air and produce staggering thrust. By strapping 4 of these modified military engines to a lightweight, swept-wing airframe, Convair guaranteed that their new jet would cruise at an astonishing 615 miles per hour. It was so fast that the company eventually named it the Convair 800E, proudly boasting that the aircraft traveled at 880 feet per second. But as the blueprints moved from the engineering department to the factory floor, Convair discovered the fatal flaw in dealing with Howard Hughes. He did not just want to buy the aircraft, he wanted to design it. What followed was a descent into manufacturing madness. Hughes was a notorious micromanager with a rapidly deteriorating psychological state. He operated completely outside standard corporate channels, frequently bypassing Convair's management and directly calling the chief engineers in the middle of the night to demand sweeping changes to the aircraft's design. His demands were legendary, expensive, and relentless. He obsessed over the interior layout, forcing engineers to redesign the cabin's seating and galley configurations multiple times. He mandated specific heavy fabrics for the seats and custom luxury fittings that ate away at the aircraft's carefully calculated weight limits. Perhaps the most disastrous of his early demands was his insistence on the aircraft's exterior finish. Hughes decreed that TWA's jets would not be painted. Instead, he wanted the aluminum skin of the fuselage to be chemically anodized in a brilliant, shimmering gold. He even temporarily forced Convair to name the aircraft the Golden Arrow. Convair's metallurgists spent months and millions of dollars trying to perfect the anodizing process on large aircraft skin panels. But when the prototype panels were exposed to the elements, the glorious gold finish rapidly oxidized, turning into an ugly mottled mustard yellow. The entire Golden Arrow concept had to be scrapped, returning the project to the name 880. But the time and money wasted on the metallurgical dead end were gone forever. For Convair, the financial quicksand was deepening. In a standard commercial aircraft program, the manufacturer freezes the design early, so the factory can set up tooling and build planes efficiently. But with Hughes, the design was never frozen. Every midnight phone call, every revised specification, and every delayed decision forced the assembly line in San Diego to grind to a halt. Draftsmen had to tear up completed blueprints. Machinists had to scrap custom-tooled parts. Delta Airlines, the other major customer, watched in growing frustration. They simply wanted a fast, reliable airplane to fly from Atlanta to Chicago. But they were forced to wait while Convair catered to the endless, eccentric whims of the billionaire in control of TWA. Convair's management realized too late that they had made a devastating error in their contract structure. They had locked in a fixed purchase price for the aircraft, but they had not built in adequate protections against customer-mandated design changes. Every time Howard Hughes changed his mind, Convair absorbed the cost. By the time the first Convair 880 prototype finally rolled out of the hangar for its maiden flight, it was a breathtaking machine to behold. It looked like a fighter jet in civilian clothes, ready to tear a hole in the sky. But behind the gleaming aluminum skin, the project was already bleeding capital at an unsustainable rate. The pursuit of the ultimate luxury speedster had blinded Convair to the most basic rule of industrial manufacturing. You cannot make a profit on an assembly line that never stops changing. The 880 was finally built. Now they just had to prove it could survive the brutal economics of the airline market. By 1959, the manufacturing floor at the Convair plant in San Diego was a theater of intense industrial choreography. Translating the blueprints of the Convair 8080 into a physical flying machine proved to be a grueling exercise in aerospace manufacturing. Because the aircraft was designed to fly faster than any other commercial airliner, it had to endure extreme aerodynamic stress. The engineers specified the thickest aluminum wingskins in the industry to prevent the wings from fluttering at near supersonic speeds. Every rivet, every structural rib, and every fuselage panel required tighter tolerances and more meticulous assembly than standard commercial aircraft. It was an expensive, labor-intensive process, but Convair was delivering. The first production aircraft began rolling out the factory doors, gleaming in the California sun. They were painted in the striking red and white livery of Trans World Airlines. Their cabins fitted with the luxurious, custom interiors that had caused so much friction during the design phase. They were complete. They were ready to fly. But they had nowhere to go. The problem was not the airplane. The problem was the man who had ordered it. While Convair was busy bending metal, Howard Hughes's massive financial empire was quietly imploding. Throughout the late 1950s, driven by his fierce rivalry with Pan Am, Hughes had gone on a monumental spending spree. He had ordered 30 Convair 8080s and 33 Boeing 707s for TWA, committing his holding company to nearly $400 million in debt, well over $4 billion in today's money. It was one of the largest private purchases in history. There was only one fatal issue. Hughes did not actually have the cash to pay for them, and he had never secured the necessary financing from Wall Street. When the bills finally came due, the major East Coast banks and insurance companies cornered the eccentric billionaire. They agreed to loan him the money to pay for the jets, but only on one absolute non-negotiable condition. Hughes had to place his controlling stock in TWA into a voting trust. He had to surrender control of his beloved airline. Hughes flatly refused. He stonewalled the banks, vanished into seclusion, and completely halted all financial decision-making. As this corporate standoff dragged on through the early months of 1960, Convair found itself trapped in an impossible position. They were manufacturing high-performance jetliners at a breakneck pace for a customer who legally could not accept delivery. The physical reality of this financial paralysis was a surreal, heartbreaking scene. Outside the Convair plant, the factory ramps began to fill up with brand-new, state-of-the-art Convair 8080s. They were towed out of the assembly halls and parked wingtip to wingtip on the concrete. They sat there week after week, month after month. Some were missing their J79 engines, waiting for Hughes to finalize separate financial negotiations with General Electric. Others were completely finished, pristine inside and out, effectively serving as the world's most advanced, most expensive paperweights. For General Dynamics, the financial toll was catastrophic. In the aviation business, an aircraft manufacturer survives on cash flow. They spend tens of millions on materials and labor up front, relying on the massive final delivery payments from the airlines to balance the books. But TWA was not taking delivery, which meant Convair was not getting paid. Every day those aircraft sat baking on the tarmac, Convair absorbed the inventory carrying costs. The company was hemorrhaging capital at a terrifying rate, forced to finance the storage of its own completed products. Worse still, while Convair was paralyzed by the TWA crisis, the rest of the aviation market was not standing still. A storm was gathering up in Seattle, and it was about to strike the Convair 880 right where it was most vulnerable. While Convair was paralyzed by the eccentricities of Howard Hughes and the ensuing financial gridlock, the Boeing Airplane Company executed a masterstroke of industrial pragmatism. Up in Washington state, Boeing's executives had not been blind to the medium-haul market that Convair was trying to monopolize. They saw the same airline route maps and recognized the exact same need for a smaller, lighter jet to serve domestic city pairs. But unlike Convair, which had spent tens of millions of dollars designing an entirely new airframe and adapting a military engine from scratch, Boeing took a route of ruthless efficiency. They looked at their already successful 707 assembly line and simply shrank the airplane. By removing sections of the fuselage, redesigning the inboard wing for shorter runways, and reducing the maximum takeoff weight, Boeing created a highly capable derivative aircraft, the Boeing 720. It was not as fast as the Convair 880. It did not possess the same exotic fighter jet pedigree. But in the boardrooms of the world's airlines, the Boeing 720 held an irresistible, almost unfair advantage: fleet commonality. For an airline that had already purchased the 707 for its long-haul international routes, buying the 720 for shorter domestic routes was a financial no-brainer. The two aircraft shared the same basic cockpit layout, allowing flight crews to seamlessly transition between them with minimal retraining. They shared the same maintenance procedures, the same spare parts pipelines, and the same ground handling equipment. In the aviation business, commonality is the ultimate currency. It drastically reduces an airline's overhead costs. Furthermore, because the 720 was a derivative design built on existing tooling, Boeing's development costs were a fraction of Convair's. They could offer the 720 at a highly competitive purchase price, and crucially, they could deliver it on a reliable schedule, completely free of the endless, paralyzing delays manufactured by Howard Hughes. The result was a slaughter in the sales department. Airlines that Convair desperately needed to woo, like United Airlines, which had been heavily courted for the 8020, took one look at the Boeing 720 and signed their contracts with Seattle. The market window that Convair had so astutely identified was rapidly slamming shut, aggressively boarded up by Boeing. Back in San Diego, the executives at General Dynamics were doing the math, and the numbers were terrifying. To recoup the massive research, development, and tooling costs of the bespoke 880 program, Convair needed to sell roughly 300 aircraft. But as 1960 arrived, the order book had completely stagnated. The initial burst of enthusiasm from TWA and Delta had not translated into an industry-wide stampede. Other carriers were frightened by the TWA delivery delays, repelled by the aircraft's high purchase price, and ultimately seduced by the safe, practical, and highly profitable economics of Boeing. Eventually, the catastrophic standoff with Howard Hughes broke. In late 1960, under immense pressure from his creditors, Hughes was forced to place his TWA stock into a voting trust, effectively stripping him of his day-to-day control over the airline. The financial blockade lifted, the checks finally cleared, and the gleaming Convair 880s began to leave the sun-baked San Diego tarmac, delivered at last into the hands of TWA and Delta Line pilots. The crisis of the factory floor was finally over. The aircraft was free to do exactly what it was built to do: fly passengers across the American continent at unprecedented speeds. But as the Convair 880 entered active revenue service, a new, much darker reality began to dawn on the airlines that had bought it. The 880 was about to prove that while speed could win headlines and set records, it could not outrun the fundamental laws of airline economics. In the spring of 1960, the Convair 880 finally slipped the surly bonds of corporate bureaucracy and took to the commercial skies. For Delta Airlines and TWA, the arrival of these swept-wing jets felt like the dawn of a magnificent new era. And for a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though Convair's grand gamble on pure speed had actually paid off. When passengers first stepped aboard the Convair 880, they were stepping into a masterclass of mid-century aviation luxury. Because the fuselage was explicitly designed to be narrower than a Boeing 707 or a Douglas DC-8, there was no dreaded middle seat in the center. The 5 abreast seating layout offered an intimacy and quiet comfort that the larger, high-density airliners simply could not match. The cabin windows were larger, flooding the interior with natural light, and the robust airframe rode through turbulence with a heavy, solid grace. But the true magic of the 880 was not found in its cabin, it was found in the cockpit. When a Convair 880 took off, it did not lumber down the runway, fighting for altitude like its competitors. It accelerated with a terrifying, pin-to-your-seat violence that left seasoned aviators grinning from ear to ear. Line pilots absolutely adored the machine. Thanks to its military interceptor DNA, it handled like a fighter jet. It possessed a roll rate, a climb rate, and a raw aerodynamic responsiveness that defied commercial logic. On its inaugural delivery flight for Delta Airlines, a Convair 880 streaked from San Diego to Miami in just 3 hours and 31 minutes, shattering transcontinental commercial speed records. It routinely cruised at 615 miles per hour, essentially leaving Boeing 707s and Douglas DC-8s eating its wake high above the American Midwest. The marketing departments capitalized on this immediately, advertising the 880 as the undisputed queen of the skies. For the wealthy business traveler of 1960, the Convair 880 was an absolute triumph. But airlines are not run by passengers, and they are certainly not run by pilots. They are run by route planners, maintenance chiefs, and above all, accountants. And in the accounting departments of Delta and TWA, the Convair 880 was rapidly transforming from a technological marvel into a terrifying financial liability. The root of the nightmare lay bolted to the wings, the General Electric CJ805 turbojet engines. The engineers at Convair had promised that these civilian derivatives of the mighty J79 military engine would deliver unprecedented performance. They kept that promise, but the laws of thermodynamics are brutally unforgiving. To achieve that monumental thrust, the engines had to burn fuel at a rate that defied all commercial sense. The original J79 was explicitly designed to propel a supersonic fighter or bomber through the sound barrier for brief, intense bursts. It was never optimized to loiter at subsonic speeds for 4 hours straight. Consequently, the CJ805 engines were hopelessly inefficient at normal passenger cruising altitudes. They guzzled jet fuel with an absolute, unquenchable thirst. The physical manifestation of this inefficiency was impossible to hide. Because the engines ran so rich every time a Convair 880 spooled up for takeoff or adjusted its throttle in flight, it unleashed a massive, towering plume of thick, unburned black carbon smoke. It was a visual signature so distinct and so dirty that air traffic controllers could spot a Convair approaching the airport from miles away simply by following the dark smear it left across the horizon. It was a spectacular show of force, but that black smoke was essentially vaporized airline profits drifting away into the atmosphere. And as the airlines began to calculate the true cost of operating their new Speed Queens, the brutal reality of Convair's design philosophy was laid bare. In the aviation business, an aircraft's survival is not measured in top speed, aesthetic beauty, or pilot affection. It is measured by a single ruthless metric, the seat mile cost. This is the exact mathematical calculation of how much money it takes an airline to fly one passenger across 1 mile of airspace. And when the route planners and accountants at TWA and Delta ran the final operational numbers on the Convair 8080, the resulting math was absolutely devastating. The core issue was a deadly combination of limited capacity and monumental consumption. To achieve its sleek aerodynamic profile, Convair had designed the 8080 with a narrow fuselage that allowed only 5 seats across the cabin. In a standard 2-class layout, the aircraft typically carried around 88 to 110 passengers. Meanwhile, the Boeing 707, the Douglas DC-8, and crucially, the derivative Boeing 720, were all utilizing wider fuselages that packed in 6 seats across, comfortably carrying 130 to 150 passengers on similar routes. The financial equation was inescapable. Every time a Convair 880 took to the sky, it was generating significantly less ticket revenue than its direct competitors, while simultaneously burning a vastly greater volume of jet fuel to sustain its blistering speed. It was a paradox of economics that no airline could absorb for long. Convair's executives had banked the entire future of the company on the premise that speed itself would be the ultimate selling point. They fiercely argued that airlines could charge a premium for faster flights, and that the sheer velocity of the 880 would allow it to fly more route segments in a single 24-hour period, thereby generating more daily revenue. But the reality of the American airspace system quickly and ruthlessly dismantled this theory. Flying at 615 miles per hour was genuinely impressive at a cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. But speed in the stratosphere did not matter when the aircraft reached its destination. Upon arriving in the crowded, heavily regulated airspace over major hubs like New York's Idlewild, soon to be JFK, Chicago's O'Hare, or Los Angeles International, the incredibly fast Convair 880 was forced to join the exact same holding patterns as every other aircraft in the sky. It had to throttle back, drop its flaps, circle in the clouds, and wait its turn to land behind slower, propeller-driven planes. The 20 or 30 minutes of time saved during the high-speed cruise phase simply evaporated in the holding stack. And worse, while it circled at low speeds waiting for clearance, the military-derived CJ805 engines continued to gorge on fuel at an alarming rate. The highly touted speed advantage proved to be a pure illusion, stripped away by the inescapable congestion of modern air traffic control. For the airlines that had already purchased the 880, there was no easy escape. Delta and TWA had to integrate these beautiful, thirsty machines into their networks, carefully deploying them on premium routes where business travelers might still be willing to pay higher fares. But for the rest of the global aviation industry, the verdict was swift, silent, and merciless. Orders for the Convair 880 completely dried up. Airlines that had been sitting on the fence, waiting to see how the aircraft performed in actual revenue service, looked at the fuel receipts and immediately walked away. The grand, romantic vision of a high-speed, medium-haul luxury cruiser had violently collided with the unforgiving reality of mass transit economics. Back at the General Dynamics headquarters, the panic was no longer theoretical, it was existential. The massive assembly line in San Diego was tooled up to produce an aircraft that the market had now firmly rejected. Only 65 Convair 880s would ever be built, a fraction of the 300 needed just to break even. The program was bleeding millions. If Convair was going to survive the commercial jet age, they had to take drastic action. They had to fix the airplane. They had to stretch the fuselage. They had to increase the passenger capacity, and remarkably, driven by a fatal mixture of desperation and engineering hubris, they believed they still had to make it even faster. By the end of 1960, the Convair division of General Dynamics was staring into a financial abyss. The 880 had failed to capture the market, and the massive San Diego assembly line was operating at a crippling loss. The company desperately needed a lifeline to justify keeping its commercial aircraft division alive. They needed a massive, momentum-shifting order from a major legacy carrier to validate their existence. And in the ruthless, hyper-competitive landscape of American aviation, they found their target, American Airlines. Led by the legendary and notoriously demanding executive C.R. Smith, American Airlines was locked in a brutal, transcontinental turf war with United Airlines and TWA. Smith had already purchased Boeing 707s for his fleet, but he was obsessed with schedule superiority. He wanted an aircraft that could fly non-stop from coast to coast, faster than Boeing's finest. He wanted to offer his premium passengers an absolute guarantee that if they flew American, they would arrive in New York or Los Angeles ahead of the competition. Convair, desperate for the business, offered Smith exactly what he wanted to hear. They proposed a radically updated, stretched version of the 880. It would be called the Convair 990 Coronado. To address the fatal flaw of the 880, the fuselage of the 990 would be lengthened by 10 feet, allowing it to carry up to 121 passengers in a standard two-class configuration, or up to 149 in high density. Finally, the aircraft would have the capacity to generate the revenue required to compete with the 707 and DC-8. But the true selling point of the 990 was not its size. It was an ironclad promise of unprecedented, earth-shrinking speed. Convair guaranteed American Airlines that the 990 would cruise at an astonishing 635 miles per hour, Mach 0.91. It would be the fastest subsonic commercial airliner in human history, brushing right up against the invisible wall of the sound barrier. But making a massive commercial airliner fly continuously at Mach 0.91 is an aerodynamic nightmare. As an aircraft approaches the speed of sound, the air flowing over the curved top of the wings accelerates even faster, eventually breaking the sound barrier locally and creating massive, invisible shock waves. These shock waves generate immense aerodynamic drag, violently buffet the airframe, and drastically increase fuel consumption. To cheat the laws of physics, Convair's engineers turned to an exotic and highly experimental aerodynamic theory known as the Whitcomb area rule. They designed four massive, teardrop-shaped pods extending backward from the trailing edge of the wings. These distinct structures, known as anti-shock bodies, were specifically designed to smooth the airflow over the wing at near supersonic speeds, delaying the formation of shock waves, reducing drag, and allowing the aircraft to slip cleanly through the high-altitude air. As an added benefit, the hollow pods doubled as auxiliary fuel tanks, addressing the aircraft's ravenous thirst. To provide the monumental thrust required for this endeavor, General Electric developed a radical new power plant, the CJ805-23. It was one of the world's first turbofan engines, featuring a unique aft fan stage bolted directly to the back of the original turbojet core. It was mechanically complex, undeniably heavy, and incredibly loud, but it generated the sheer brute force necessary to push the heavy airframe to Mach 0.91. Blinded by the prospect of a massive 25 aircraft order, Convair's management eagerly signed the contract with American Airlines. But buried within the legal text of that agreement was a contractual guillotine. C.R. Smith, a man who left nothing to chance, had demanded a strict performance guarantee. If the Convair 990 failed to meet the exact promised speed of 635 miles per hour, American Airlines had the right to demand millions of dollars in financial penalties, force Convair to fix the planes at their own expense, or cancel the order entirely. Convair had just staked the entire survival of General Dynamics' commercial empire on a radical, untested aerodynamic theory. They had bet everything that they could force the air to behave exactly the way their blueprints said it would. Inside the sprawling General Dynamics plant in San Diego, the atmosphere shifted from quiet desperation to a frantic, almost feverish intensity. The original Convair 880 assembly line had essentially become a ghost town, producing a trickle of aircraft that no one wanted to buy. All of the company's capital, its finest engineering minds, and its thousands of machinists were rapidly redirected toward the 990 Coronado. The mandate from corporate headquarters in New York was absolute. Build the aircraft for American Airlines. Meet the guaranteed speed and save the division. To the workers on the factory floor, the 990 looked less like a traditional passenger plane and more like a heavy military bomber being dressed up for civilian service. The most striking visual features were the four massive speed capsules, the anti-shock bodies, protruding far past the trailing edge of the swept wings. These structures were huge, measuring over 20 feet long, constructed of aluminum and fiberglass. They looked like sleek, unguided missiles permanently fused to the airframe. The engineers promised that these bizarre appendages would magically smooth the turbulent air at Mach 0.91, but to the veteran mechanics riveting them into place, they were incredibly complex. Heavy additions that required flawless manufacturing tolerances. The power plants only added to the immense mechanical burden. General Electric's new CJ805-23 engines featured a heavy aft fan bolted to the rear of the exhaust nozzle. While this design did increase thrust and somewhat improve fuel efficiency compared to the thirsty 880, it drastically altered the weight distribution of the aircraft. The wings had to be heavily reinforced to support the heavier engines and the massive anti-shock bodies, adding thousands of pounds of dead weight to an airframe that was supposedly designed to slice through the air with effortless grace. The financial trap Convair had walked into was becoming tighter with every rivet driven. In the commercial aviation business, manufacturers typically build in a margin of error. Prototypes rarely hit their exact performance targets right out of the factory doors. They require months of fine-tuning, weight reduction, and aerodynamic tweaking. But C.R. Smith's contract with American Airlines left absolutely no room for the realities of flight testing. It was a draconian legal document that tied the purchase price directly to the airspeed indicator. If the 990 was even a few miles per hour slower than the guaranteed 635 mph, Convair would be forced to pay crippling financial penalties or watch the entire 25 aircraft order evaporate. They had effectively allowed the accountants of an airline to dictate the physics of a highly experimental aerospace program. By the time the first Convair 990 prototype was towed out of the assembly hall in the early months of 1961, it was a breathtaking, intimidating machine. Bathed in the California sunlight, wearing its gleaming silver skin, it looked undeniably fast even while standing perfectly still on the concrete tarmac. It was a monument to mid-century American industrial hubris, a physical manifestation of the belief that enough money, enough thrust, and enough engineering willpower could bludgeon the laws of aerodynamics into submission. The executives at General Dynamics, the engineers in San Diego, and the route planners at American Airlines all held their collective breath. The blueprints had promised a miracle. The wind tunnel scale models had confirmed the math. Now it was time to take the multi-million-dollar gamble into the open sky and see if the air would actually behave the way Convair had ordered it to. But the wind tunnel is a controlled, sterile environment. The open stratosphere is not. And the sky was about to deliver a very expensive, very brutal lesson in the limits of human ambition. On January 24, 1961, the first prototype of the Convair 990 took to the air over the skies of Southern California. To the executives and factory workers watching from the ground, the gleaming, swept-wing giant looked like the salvation of their company. It was heavily modified, brutally powerful, and theoretically capable of outrunning anything Boeing or Douglas had ever put into the commercial sky. But up in the cockpit, as the Convair test pilots pushed the throttles of the massive General Electric aft fan engines forward, a terrifying reality began to unfold. The mandate was clear. The aircraft had to reach and maintain a cruising speed of Mach 1, or 635 miles per hour. This was not a goal. It was a legally binding guarantee signed with C.R. Smith and American Airlines. As the 990 climbed into the thin, freezing air of the upper stratosphere and began its acceleration runs, the pilots watched the airspeed indicators intently. The aircraft pushed past 500 miles per hour, then 550, then 600. But as it approached the absolute limits of subsonic flight, the air around the airplane stopped behaving the way the blueprint said it would. Instead of slicing cleanly through the atmosphere, the 990 hit a massive invisible wall of aerodynamic drag. The aircraft began to shudder violently. Severe buffeting rattled the airframe, a physical manifestation of turbulent, chaotic airflow tearing across the wings. The pilots pushed the engines to their absolute limits, burning fuel at an agonizing rate. But the speed indicator refused to climb to the promised mark. The 990 was not flying at Mach 091. It was nowhere close. In its original configuration, it struggled to efficiently break 600 miles per hour without shaking itself apart or consuming so much fuel that it could barely complete a transcontinental route. Back in San Diego, the engineering department plunged into a state of absolute, unmitigated panic. How had a company with such a profound mastery of supersonic military interceptors built a passenger plane that was essentially fighting itself in the air? The answer lay in the limits of mid-century testing technology. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, aerospace engineers did not have the benefit of modern computational fluid dynamics. They could not simulate complex airflow on a supercomputer. Instead, they relied on scale models in wind tunnels. But placing a tiny wooden or metal model in a wind tunnel could not perfectly replicate the complex, high-speed aerodynamic interference of a full-sized aircraft. Convair's design for the 990 was incredibly geometrically complex. They had four massive, heavy-engine nacelles hanging on pylons beneath a highly swept wing, and on top of that wing, they had bolted the four giant, teardrop-shaped anti-shock bodies. In theory, according to the Whitcomb area rule, those shock bodies were supposed to smooth the airflow and eliminate drag. But in full-scale reality, the interaction between the engine pylons, the wing leading edge, and the shock bodies created a chaotic vortex of turbulent air. Instead of preventing drag, the modifications were actually generating it. Convair had bet the entire survival of General Dynamics' commercial division on the assumption that their wind tunnel math was flawless. Now, with the aircraft fully built and the American Airlines delivery schedule looming, they discovered their math was fatally wrong. The company was now legally obligated to deliver an aircraft that violated the fundamental laws of physics. If they could not somehow find a way to squeeze more speed out of a fundamentally flawed aerodynamic design, American Airlines had the legal right to walk away from the massive 25 aircraft order, a move that would instantly bankrupt the entire Convair commercial program. The engineers had to go back to the drawing board, but this time, the clock was running out, and the factory floor was already full of broken promises. In the spring and summer of 1961, the Convair test facility in Southern California transformed into a desperate aerodynamic triage ward. To figure out exactly why their masterpiece was fighting the air, the engineers resorted to an old, low-tech visualization method. They taped thousands of small tufts of yarn across the wings and the anti-shock bodies of the 990 prototype. They then flew a chase plane alongside it, filming the yarn in flight. When they reviewed the footage, the visual evidence was horrifying. The yarn tufts between the heavy engine pylons and the leading edge of the wing were violently fluttering forward and in circles. The airflow was completely separating. The complex geometry of the 990 was acting less like an airfoil and more like an aerodynamic brake. Fixing it required agonizing trial-and-error physical surgery on a fully built commercial airliner. The engineers had to design extensive aerodynamic fairings to blend the engine pylons into the wing. They had to cut back the engine cowlings. They had to resculpt the leading edges. Every single modification required new blueprints, custom metal fabrication, and expensive retesting. Every ounce of added metal increased the aircraft's empty weight, which in turn increased its fuel consumption. But the most devastating cost was time. As the weeks of frantic modifications bled into months, the guaranteed delivery dates for American Airlines slipped completely off the calendar. In New York, C.R. Smith was watching the debacle unfold with cold, unsentimental clarity. He had ordered a fleet of 635-mile-per-hour jetliners to dominate the transcontinental market in 1961. Instead, he was looking at a heavily delayed, experimental aircraft that was currently slower than the Boeing 707s he already owned. Smith held all the leverage, and he knew it. He formally notified General Dynamics that Convair was in breach of contract. He threatened to invoke the cancellation clause and walk away from the entire 25-aircraft order. For the executives at Convair, this was the doomsday scenario. If American Airlines canceled, Convair would be left holding dozens of custom-built, multi-million-dollar jetliners that no other airline in the world wanted to buy. It would instantly bankrupt the entire division. Backed against an absolute financial wall, Convair pleaded for time. After a grueling series of aerodynamic retrofits, a package that would later be known as the speed capsule modifications, the engineers managed to clean up the airflow. The 990 went back to the skies, and the airspeed indicator finally climbed. It pushed past 600 miles per hour, settling reliably in the 610 to 620 mph range. It was a monumental engineering achievement. The Convair 990 had officially become the fastest subsonic commercial airliner on the planet, a title it would essentially hold for the rest of the 20th century. But in the ruthless world of corporate law, close enough does not matter. The aircraft was still short of the 635-minute absolute guarantee stipulated in C.R. Smith's contract. Knowing that Convair could not survive a cancellation, American Airlines executed a brutal corporate maneuver. They agreed to accept the delayed, slightly slower aircraft, but they demanded a horrific penalty. Convair was forced to drastically slash the purchase price of every single 990 delivered. Furthermore, they were forced to agree to a continuing modification program, absorbing all future costs to try and drag the airframes up to the original promised speed. The gamble had completely failed. The massive American Airlines order, the lifeline that was supposed to rescue the Convair division, had just been transformed into a legally binding financial hemorrhage. While the engineers in Southern California were frantically bolting speed capsules onto the wings of the Convair 990, a much quieter, far more lethal reckoning was taking place on the opposite side of the country. In the hushed, wood-paneled boardrooms of New York City, the top executives of General Dynamics were no longer looking at blueprints or wind tunnel data. They were looking at the ledger, and the numbers written on those pages represented an industrial apocalypse. In the aviation business, building a magnificent flying machine is only half the battle. The other half is building it at a volume that absorbs the staggering costs of research, development, tooling, and factory overhead. To simply break even on the A380 and 1990 programs, Convair's internal accounting dictated that they needed to sell approximately 300 airframes. They did not sell 300. By the time the final tallies were drawn, the San Diego assembly line had produced just 65 Convair 880s. The mighty 990 Coronado, the aircraft designed to save the division, fared even worse, with only 37 units ever built. In total, just 102 aircraft rolled off the line. It was an abysmal, catastrophic production run for a major commercial aerospace program. The financial anatomy of this failure was terrifying in its scope. Every single mistake, every delay, and every burst of engineering hubris had carried a devastating price tag. There were the millions wasted on Howard Hughes' demand for a golden anodized finish that instantly corroded. There were the massive inventory holding costs absorbed when TWA's financial paralysis left brand new planes parked on the tarmac for months. There were the astronomical research and development expenditures required to turn a supersonic military engine into a commercial power plant. And finally, there was the fatal American Airlines contract. To appease C.R. Smith and compensate for the 990's failure to hit its guaranteed speed on time, Convair had been forced to slash the purchase price of the aircraft, absorbing millions in penalties while simultaneously funding a wildly expensive aerodynamic retrofit program. They were effectively paying the airlines to take the planes off their hands. The money was simply gone. It had vanished into the thin, high-altitude air of the stratosphere. For General Dynamics, this was no longer an isolated failure. It was a contagion threatening the entire corporate empire. General Dynamics was not just an aircraft manufacturer. They were a cornerstone of the American military-industrial complex. They built the Atlas intercontinental ballistic missiles that carried the nation's nuclear deterrent. At their electric boat division in Connecticut, they were building the first generations of nuclear-powered submarines for the United States Navy. These were incredibly lucrative, highly successful government defense contracts. But the commercial aircraft division in San Diego was bleeding capital so rapidly that it threatened to drag the entire submarine and missile empire down with it. The defense side of the corporation was effectively subsidizing the disastrous commercial ambitions of Convair. The board of directors realized they were staring at a financial black hole that could completely destroy one of the most important industrial conglomerates in the United States. The final audit was a staggering, historically unprecedented blow. General Dynamics was forced to write down a net corporate loss of $425 million. Adjusted for inflation, that figure represents well over $4 billion today. In the early 1960s, it stood as the largest single corporate loss ever suffered by an American enterprise. In the face of such absolute financial ruin, corporate sentimentality evaporates. The executives in New York made the only logical, albeit brutal decision available to them. They pulled the plug. The mandate came down from headquarters to the San Diego plant. Finish the existing orders and then shut it all down. There would be no Convair 1000. There would be no next-generation commercial jet. General Dynamics was permanently exiting the commercial airliner business. They were surrendering the sky entirely to Boeing and Douglas. The human toll of this corporate surrender was immense. The sprawling Convair factories, which had pulsed with the intense, deafening rhythm of thousands of rivet guns and heavy presses, began to go quiet. As the final 990s were towed out of the assembly halls, the workforce was systematically dismantled. Thousands of highly skilled draftsmen, metallurgists, aeronautical engineers, and factory floor mechanics, the people who had poured their lives into building the fastest commercial jets on Earth, were suddenly holding pink slips. The massive jigs and tooling required to build the 880 and 990 were quietly broken down and sold for scrap. The drafting tables were cleared. The giant hangars that had birthed the Queen of the Skies were repurposed for military contracts or left completely empty, echoing with the silence of a dead ambition. Convair had set out to build a machine that could outrun time itself. In the end, they could not even outrun their own balance sheet. But while the factory was dead, the aircraft were not. Over 100 Convair jets were now out in the world, wearing the liveries of American, Delta, TWA, and Swissair. They were the fastest things in the commercial sky. But as the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, the world they were designed for was about to radically, violently change. And the orphaned speed queens of San Diego were about to face an environment far more hostile than the wind tunnel. The San Diego assembly lines had gone cold, the massive production jigs were dismantled, and the thousands of aerospace engineers who had built them were scattered to the winds. But for the 102 Convair 880s and 990s that actually made it out of the factory doors, the story was far from over. Throughout the 1960s, these orphaned aircraft did exactly what they were designed to do. They dominated the upper atmosphere. In the liveries of Trans World Airlines, Delta, American Airlines, Swissair, and Scandinavian Airlines. The Convairs were the undisputed speed kings of the commercial sky. For a brief, glittering window in time, they offered a genuinely premium experience that no other manufacturer could match. Passengers marveled at the quiet, intimately sized fiber-breast cabins, insulated by the thickest aluminum skin in the industry. Meanwhile, line pilots reveled in the raw, fighter-like power that allowed them to outclimb and outcruise anything Boeing or Douglas could put in their way. A Convair captain could request a cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, push the throttles forward, and leave a trail of 700 civilians wallowing in their turbulent wake. But this operational glory was a fragile illusion. It was an ecosystem built entirely on the assumption that the world would remain the same, that passengers would always pay a premium for speed, and critically, that jet fuel would remain cheap and plentiful forever. Even before the global economy violently turned against them, the Convairs were facing a brutal reality check. By the late 1960s, the aviation industry was undergoing another massive tectonic shift. Up in Seattle, Boeing introduced the 747 wide-body, a gargantuan twin-aisle behemoth that could carry nearly 400 passengers. Douglas quickly answered with the DC-10, and Lockheed introduced the L-1011 TriStar. The entire philosophy of commercial aviation shifted abruptly from maximum speed to maximum mass capacity. Airlines realized that the true path to long-term profitability was not flying a handful of wealthy business travelers across the country at Mach 090, but flying hundreds of people at Mach 085. Next to the cavernous, wide-body jumbo jets, the narrow, low-capacity Convair airframes suddenly looked cramped, outdated, and hopelessly uneconomical. The luxury speedster business model that had birthed them was dying a quiet death. And then the world ran out of cheap oil. In October 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries proclaimed an oil embargo against nations that supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Almost overnight, the price of crude oil quadrupled. For the global aviation industry, it was a massive, system-wide financial shock. But for the Convair 880 and 990, it was an absolute, inescapable death sentence. The fatal flaw that had plagued the aircraft from its very inception, the unquenchable thirst of its military-derived General Electric engines, was no longer just an accounting frustration. It was a fatal liability. The cost to fuel a Convair for a transcontinental flight skyrocketed past the point of any possible passenger revenue generation. Even if every single seat in the cabin was sold at absolute full fare, the airlines were actively losing money every time the J79-derived engines spooled up. The math was brutally simple and completely unforgiving. A Boeing 707 could carry more passengers while burning significantly less fuel. A Boeing 727 could fly the exact same domestic routes with 3 engines instead of 4, drastically reducing operating costs. Furthermore, the dawn of the 1970s brought a newly awakened environmental consciousness to American infrastructure. The heavy, towering trails of thick black carbon smoke that the Convairs left behind, combined with their deafening, ground-shaking engine roar, made them primary targets for new airport noise abatement and emissions regulations. They were too small, too loud, too dirty, and impossibly expensive to fly. They became the most toxic assets in the legacy airline fleets. The major carriers acted with ruthless efficiency to protect their balance sheets. Delta Airlines, which had once proudly marketed the Convair 880 as the undisputed queen of the skies, began aggressively purging them from its network. TWA and American Airlines rapidly followed suit. Aircraft that were barely a decade old, magnificent machines with heavy airframes over-engineered to last a lifetime, were unceremoniously withdrawn from frontline service. They were sold off at fire sale prices, their residual value plummeting to virtually nothing. For a few years, they found brief, undignified second lives with obscure charter companies, private travel clubs, and secondary operators in Latin America and the Caribbean. Airlines like Modern Air Transport and the Spanish charter carrier Spantax operated fleets of second-hand Convairs, utilizing them for cheap holiday flights where the rock-bottom acquisition cost momentarily offset the brutal fuel bills. But even in this secondary market, the reality of the airframe caught up with them. The heavy maintenance requirements, the complex anti-shock bodies of the 990, and the specialized parts pipeline required to keep the military-grade engines running made them nearly impossible for small operators to sustain. When something broke, there was no factory in San Diego to call for a replacement part. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the final exodus was complete. The once mighty speed queens were flown on their final, one-way trips to the arid, unforgiving deserts of the American Southwest. They were towed into places like the Mojave Air and Spaceport in California and the sprawling, dusty boneyards of Marana, Arizona. There, under the baking desert sun, they were parked out in the scrub brush. Their engines were removed, their valuable instruments were stripped from the cockpits, and their cockpit windows were taped over with reflective foil. They sat in long, silent rows, massive aluminum monuments to an era of aviation that had come and gone in the blink of an eye. The airplanes that had been built to outrun time itself were finally standing completely still, slowly being consumed by the desert dust, waiting for the scrappers' torches to erase them from the sky. Today, if you want to find a physical remnant of Convair's grand commercial ambition, you will not find it at a major international airport. You will not find it in the hangars of a legacy airline or listed on a modern flight schedule. Instead, you must travel to Memphis, Tennessee, to the grounds of Graceland. There, sitting quietly as a museum piece, is a Convair 880 named the Lisa Marie. In 1975, long after the airlines had realized the terrifying economic math of the aircraft, Elvis Presley purchased a retired 880 from Delta Airlines for $250,000. He then spent over $800,000, a staggering sum at the time, customizing the interior with a master bedroom, a conference room, gold-plated bathroom fixtures, and a quadraphonic sound system. For a global music icon who lived entirely outside the boundaries of normal financial logic, the Convair 880 was the perfect machine. It was fiercely exclusive, incredibly loud, undeniably beautiful, and faster than almost anything else in the civilian sky. The Lisa Marie perfectly fulfilled Howard Hughes' original, eccentric vision for the aircraft. It was the ultimate private luxury speedster. But commercial aviation is not a rock star's vanity project. It is a mass transit system. And the tragic legacy of the Convair 880 and 990 is rooted entirely in the company's failure to understand the difference. When historians look back at the collapse of General Dynamics' commercial airliner division, they do not see a failure of engineering capability. On a purely mechanical level, the engineers in San Diego achieved something magnificent. They took the raw, unbridled power of a supersonic nuclear bomber and successfully domesticated it for civilian use. They built an airframe so robust that it could withstand the punishing aerodynamic stress of flying right up against the edge of the sound barrier, hour after hour, cycle after cycle. The Convair 990 Coronado, with its bizarre teardrop-shaped anti-shock bodies and its roaring aft fan engines, remains one of the most mechanically fascinating passenger aircraft ever constructed. The failure of Convair was a failure of philosophy. Because their DNA was forged in the Cold War military-industrial complex, they believed that performance was the ultimate metric of success. In the realm of fighter jets and strategic bombers, speed is survival. If an interceptor cannot catch its target, it is useless, regardless of how fuel-efficient it might be. Convair brought this exact military mindset into the commercial marketplace. They assumed that airlines would evaluate an aircraft the same way a four-star general evaluates a weapon system, by its maximum theoretical capability. They were wrong. The airline industry does not care about maximum theoretical capability. It cares about the seat mile cost. Boeing and Douglas understood this fundamental truth. They understood that an airline is essentially a highly complex logistics company operating on razor-thin financial margins. The airlines did not need a sports car. They needed a dependable, highly standardized, easily maintainable bus. Boeing's triumph with the 707 and the derivative 720 was not an aerodynamic victory over Convair. It was a victory of economic pragmatism. Boeing offered fleet commonality, reliable delivery schedules, and wider fuselages that packed in more revenue-generating seats per flight. They understood that a plane flying at 550 miles per hour fully loaded with paying passengers will always defeat a plane flying at 615 miles per hour with a half-empty, narrow cabin. The Convair 880 and 990 serve as the ultimate cautionary tale for the aerospace industry. You cannot build a fighter jet, painted in airline colors, and expect it to survive the brutal realities of the balance sheet. Engineering brilliance, no matter how spectacular, is completely irrelevant if the market cannot afford to pay the fuel bill. Yet, despite the colossal financial catastrophe they caused, it is difficult to look back at the Convair Speed Queens without a profound sense of awe. They belong to a very specific, incredibly fleeting window of mid-century American history. It was the absolute height of the space race, an era defined by a limitless, almost intoxicating optimism. It was a time when the boundaries of physics were viewed not as absolute limits, but as temporary obstacles meant to be shattered by sheer American industrial willpower. The engineers at Convair were given a blank check and told to conquer the wind. They were allowed to push commercial flight to an extreme that had never been seen before, and quite frankly, has rarely been seen since. They designed machines that left towering trails of black smoke across the sky, announcing their presence with a ground-shaking roar that demanded the world look up. They represented a romantic, completely unsustainable vision of flight, a vision where the journey was just as thrilling and just as important as the destination. The massive factory in San Diego never built another commercial airliner. General Dynamics retreated entirely to the safety of defense contracting, leaving the passenger market permanently in the hands of its rivals. But for a brief moment in time, before the oil crises, before the era of high-bypass turbofans, and before the sky was completely taken over by the cold logic of the spreadsheet, Convair ruled the upper atmosphere. They built the fastest, proudest, and most financially devastating passenger jets the world had ever seen. And they left behind a lesson that is permanently carved into the sky. Speed is a luxury, but economics is the law. The sky above us today is a miracle of efficiency. Every minute of every day, thousands of nearly identical, hyper-efficient, twin-engine jetliners cross the globe. They are marvels of modern logistics, carrying millions of people with an unprecedented level of safety and economic precision. But as you watch them trace their slow, quiet paths across the stratosphere, it is hard not to feel a slight pang of nostalgia for the daring, unapologetic era that Convair tried to build. The story of the Convair 880 and 990 is not just the story of a failed commercial division or a staggering, record-breaking financial write-off. It is a defining chapter in the history of American industrial ambition. It forces us to confront a cold, uncomfortable truth about modern capitalism. The most technologically advanced product does not always win. In the brutal collision between engineering perfection and economic viability, the spreadsheet always holds the final veto. General Dynamics gave their aeronautical engineers a blank canvas and allowed them to build a masterpiece of absolute speed. But they built it for a world that was rapidly deciding it cared much more about the cost of the ticket than the thrill of the journey. The speed queens of San Diego were magnificent, loud, thirsty, and ultimately doomed by their own uncompromising brilliance. They were the right airplanes, built at the highest possible standard for entirely the wrong reasons. Today, the massive factories that birthed them have been repurposed or torn down. The roaring, smoke-trailing engines have been permanently silenced in the desert boneyards. But the legacy of the Convair jets remains a powerful, haunting reminder of the delicate and unforgiving balance required to sustain an industrial empire. You can cheat the wind, you can delay the shockwaves, and you can push the boundaries of physics. But you cannot outrun the market, no matter how fast you fly. If you found this journey into the forgotten era of commercial aviation history fascinating, please leave a comment below. Let us know what other fallen empires of industry you want us to explore next. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more documentaries on the monumental triumphs and catastrophic failures that built the modern world. See you in the next one.